Hi, we're out on our range today, and once again, no, you haven't won a prize. That's a scam. Now, what we're talking about today is my top 10 list. Yes, not a top 5, a top 10 list of things that, in my opinion, you need to know as a firearms owner. Now, when it comes to firearms owners, there's many different shapes and sizes, all the way from that person who owns one firearm that they keep in their nightstand and they go to the range every 2 or 3 years, to the kind of person who owns an extensive collection and does various types of competition shooting and various types of hunting, and they have home defense and concealed carry and collectible firearms, and they are constantly going to or from the range or to or from some kind of firearm activity. And there's both ends of the scale, and what I'm going to say is going to be applicable to pretty much everyone, but most applicable to that type of person who owns a few different firearms for a few different activities and is on a fairly regular basis going to and from the range or to and from some kind of firearm activity. Okay, now today's presentation comes with 4 caveats. 1, the top 10 list in this subject is something I could go on about for days. So we're going to make 2 versions of today's presentation, a short version and a long version. You're watching the short version. So before you tell me about things that I left out or neglected to say, please remember this is the short version. Now the second thing is, everything I'm going to say today are my opinions, and I make no claim that my opinion has its origin in the mind of greatness. Number 3 on my list of caveats is, a lot of times I will say that I'm just showing you how I do it and I'm not trying to give you any advice. Today, I am giving you advice, and I am telling you the things that I think you need to know. Now, the 4th caveat is, these are numbered 1 through 10 just for organizational purposes. Number 1 on the list is, in my opinion, the most important. Number 2 through 10 are just for organizational reasons, and I'm not trying to say any one of those is any more important than any of the others. Now, with that, what is number 1? Number 1 on my list of things you need to know, the 4 safety rules. Number 1, never point a firearm at anything you're not willing to kill or destroy. 2, treat all firearms as if they're loaded, even when you know they're not. 3, keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on target. And 4, be sure of your target and what's beyond it. Now, you might hear those 4 worded a little differently, different times and different places by different people. Sometimes they might even be in a different order. But that's the 4 safety rules, and they're pretty straightforward. Now, what's number 2 on the list? Let's take a look. Point 2 on my top 10 list is understanding your local firearms laws. Now, this comes with a disclaimer. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a legal scholar. Also, spoiler alert, when it comes to being a firearms owner, understanding the law is so important that on my top 10 list, 4 of the points on the top 10 have something to do with the law. But here at point number 2, we're talking about having a good working knowledge of your local laws. Now, let me use the example of driving. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a legal scholar. I don't know every aspect of everything when it comes to vehicular law. But I do understand the basics. Red means stop, green means go, yellow means go very fast. That when you turn, you have to use your turn signal, and in the jurisdiction in which I reside, at least last I checked, you have to turn that turn signal on 100 feet before you make that turn. You can turn on a red light, but you have to make a complete stop first, and when you make a turn, it can't cross a lane of moving traffic. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And you have to understand the basics of those, and you have to understand that laws change occasionally. Now, let me give you an example that has nothing to do with firearms. There's various types of blades that are unlawful to possess, and I want to speak specifically about the switchblade knife. That's like a pocket knife. It's a folding knife, but it has a spring. You press the button and the blade pops open. Okay, in the jurisdiction in which I live, laws governing that particular type of knife have changed many times. When I was a kid, they were just illegal. You couldn't possess them. Then the law changed and you could. And if I remember right, it changed back and you couldn't. Then it changed to where you could own one. And the way the law sits right now, I actually checked on this about a month ago because it came up in a different conversation, is that in the jurisdiction in which I live, switchblade knives are legal to own, but they are considered to be weapons. So, for example, I've got my Swiss Army knife, which has no spring assisted. You have to actually pull it open. And this I can carry in my pocket. In the jurisdiction in which I live, blade length is totally irrelevant. Blade length does not matter. But if this were a switchblade where you press the button and that blade popped open, then it would be considered a weapon. So then, if I put this in my pocket, it would be carrying a concealed weapon. So they're legal, but there's laws governing them. And this law has changed several times throughout the course of my life. And you have to understand that when it comes to firearms laws, they go back and forth sometimes too. So you not only have to educate yourself on your local laws, you have to be aware that they can change occasionally. Okay, now point 2, that's pretty straightforward. Point 3 is going to seem very similar, but it's actually a bit different, and it's something that I can't stress enough. Let's take a look at point 3. Point 3, as a firearms owner, you need to know that firearms laws can be drastically different from one jurisdiction to the next. Obviously, if you go from one country to the next, firearm laws can be very different. But I mean here in the United States, when you go from one state to the next, sometimes one county, sometimes one municipality to the next, firearms laws can be very different. Now, when I say that, a lot of people are nodding their heads. Of course, you already know that. Give me a moment to expand on what I'm talking about. Now, again, I'm going to use the driving example. You may have noticed that as you drive on a freeway, when you cross a state line, the speed limit sometimes changes. You might be in this state where the speed limit is 80 and then cross the border into this state where the speed limit is 70. Laws vary from one state to the next. And that has to do with traffic laws, property laws, and firearms laws. It has to do with almost every type of law. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to be aware of the concept, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When you go from this state where the speed limit's 80 into this state where the speed limit's 70, and the highway patrol radars you at going 80 in a 70 zone, he is not going to say, oh, he's from the other state where it's legal to do that, he's okay. No, he's going to expect you to obey that local law, and he's going to write you a ticket for doing 80 in a 70 zone. Conversely, when you go from the state where it's 70 to the state where it's 80, you don't have to obey your own home state laws. You can drive 80. You've got to understand that the law can change, and you're going to be expected to follow the local laws. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. The problem here is that in the commentary I see in this format, it has been demonstrated to me that there are a lot of people out there who don't understand this concept. Now, I'll see a comment from somebody who will say something like, he lived in California and the gun laws were so restrictive that he moved out of California to some other state. Okay, so he understands that different states have different gun laws. Then that same person will watch my presentation on my top 5 handguns for deer hunting, and he will make a scathing comment berating me and telling me what a poor example I'm setting and how terrible I am for advocating something that's illegal. Because in the state he resides, you can't hunt deer with a handgun. In the state I reside, you can. And so even though he seems to understand moving out of California that different states have different laws, he still doesn't get it. He still doesn't understand that different states have different firearms laws, different hunting laws, and so forth. And you have to understand this, and you have to abide by it. And if you spend any significant amount of time going from one jurisdiction to another, you have to grasp that gun laws can be very different. And you are going to be expected to abide by those local laws. Now, I'm not from the East Coast, but it is my understanding that in Vermont, they have what's called constitutional carry. You don't even need a permit to carry a concealed handgun. Okay, I'm going to hypothesize that if you cross the border from Vermont to Massachusetts, you're going to see some drastically different firearms laws. Now, out on the West Coast, where I am from, I can tell you that if you go from Oregon to Washington State, the gun laws can be significantly different. If you go from Oregon to California, the gun laws are drastically different. You may as well be on a different planet. And you've got to understand that. And I harp on this so much because the commentary in this format has made it very clear to me that there's a lot of people who don't understand that concept. Okay, Having said all of that, let's go on to point 4. Now, point 4 on the list is something I do not want to talk about. I'm going to be brief. I will expand on it more in the long version. But point 4 is you need to know that some police officers hate guns and hate gun owners. And you have to be aware of that. Now, the police represent themselves as highly trained professionals, and the great majority of them are. But there is an element out there, and I don't mean 1 in 10,000. No, I mean it's a larger element than that, even though they still are certainly a minority, that enforce something called the should-be law. A particular police officer looks at an activity or possession of a certain thing that's perfectly legal, but he thinks it should be prohibited, and so he takes it upon himself to make a lot of grief for anybody who has that thing or does that thing. And you see this a lot on the subject of firearms. There's a lot of police officers that have this mentality that anyone who has a firearm must be a criminal. And there's a mentality sometimes that I can only compare to slut shaming, that if I go to the range and I brought a half dozen guns with me as opposed to 1 or 2, then I must be up to no good. And I have encountered these things. And to give you a very short version, I was pulled over by the police. It was at night. I have a holstered handgun on the seat next to me. Put my hands up here on the open window. He asked to see my driver's license and insurance. I told him I have those. I'd be happy to show them to you, but before I do anything, I've got the holstered handgun on the seat. He shines his flashlight over, sees it, says, okay. And he just has me step out of the car. I show him my driver's license. Yeah, no sweat. And he actually said to me, "We like people like you," close quote. Just because I'm not making his life difficult. Now, on another occasion, virtually the same thing happened. I got my handgun next to me, and that police officer's reaction was to say to me, quote, "What the hell's the gun for?" Close quote. Now, I may have mentioned this before. I was in uniform at the time. I was in the Army at the time, and I was on my way to the National Guard Armory. That particular armory has an indoor range. Now, on my way to drill, we have an indoor range. "No, you don't!" And I got a little pissy with him. "Yes, we do. You want me to take you there and show it to you?" And he backed off a little from that because I think he realized that I wasn't breaking any law. But that's kind of the situation where the next thing you know, you're handcuffed and in jail, and he's making something up. Because again, and that didn't happen in this case, he let me go, but again, I have encountered, and they represent a great minority, but I have encountered police officers who hate guns and hate gun owners so much that they're perfectly willing to lie, to file false police reports, and perjure themselves to jack you up for something that they know you didn't do. They know you didn't commit any crime just because they hate guns and gun owners that much. And they represent the minority. I mean, a small minority, but as a firearms owner, you need to know that they're out there. Okay, point 5. Point 5 is a simple one. Never use the word always, and always avoid the word never. Firearms come in so many different shapes and sizes that you can't say that doesn't exist. Remington never made one of those. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the gun show, and somebody asked me if Remington ever made a double-barreled shotgun. And he told me that he had a friend who was adamant that Remington never made a double-barreled shotgun. Well, it just so happens I have a colleague that owns a Remington double-barreled shotgun, so I know they made at least a few. And I told him, yes, they made at least a few. I don't know how many. And anybody who uses words like always or never probably doesn't know much. Firearms have been made for so long in so many different countries, and then people customize their own firearms. You really need to avoid words like always and never. That's a simple one. Let's go to point 6. Point 6 on the list, PMCS, that's Preventive Maintenance Checks and Services. Guns need to be regularly maintained. Okay, that's obvious, and pretty much everyone knows that. I wouldn't put that on a top 10 list. However, what I would say is point 6. Even firearms that are not being regularly used need regular PMCS. You have that really collectible firearm that you hardly ever even look at and it's clear in the back of the safe. Yeah, you really need to pull that out of there every couple of months, make sure it's lubed properly, make sure that it's still in decent condition. Different storage methods in different environments will dictate just how often you need to get that out and look at it. A lot of people will have in their bedroom a firearm just leaning in the corner. That's their home defense gun. Okay, you really do have to check that firearm occasionally, especially if it's got a detachable box magazine. Some magazines aren't meant to be loaded indefinitely, and trade those magazines out occasionally. Sometimes you leave that sitting there so long that it's collected so much dust that the laser sight you have on it, because you anticipate you may have to use it in the dark, has gotten so much dust on it you can't even see the beam. Now let me give you a real-world example. A colleague of mine was doing concealed carry. He was pocket carrying a small auto-loading pistol. Okay, well, you know that when it comes to concealed carry, especially pocket carry, you might sweat on that firearm and it might get rusty. You've got to do PMCS to it. Well, in this case, he doesn't really have all that sweaty of a job, and it's a nickel-plated firearm, so that wasn't a big concern, and especially he can just pull it out and see that there's no rust concerns. But after carrying it in his pocket for several months, we went to the range one day, and he pulls the thing out, and he's going to shoot it, and he pulls the trigger, and it didn't go off. After being in his pocket for that long, it had somehow gotten so much lint inside this auto-loading pistol that the firing pin wasn't able to go forward and hit the primer. Had to completely disassemble it and do extensive cleaning to it. And so he had been carrying a pistol that, for who knows how many weeks or even a few months, had been non-operational because he hadn't done any PMCS to it. And you could argue, well, that gun was in regular use because it was in his pocket every day, but I'm going to say it was not regularly being used because it wasn't being fired on a regular basis. But the point is, even firearms that are not regularly used need regular PMCS. That's a simple one. Okay, let's go on to point 7. Number 7 on the list is something that when I say it, you're going to get a look on your face kind of like this. And you're going to say something like, "No kidding, Paul, is there anybody that didn't know that?" And the answer is, of course, we always expect people wouldn't know this, especially little kids. But it has become alarmingly clear to me just in the recent past that there's a high number of people out there who don't know this. And the this I'm talking about is number 7. Television and movies and video games are not real. If you watch television and movies, you see a lot of police-based crime dramas. You see a lot of westerns. In the movies, you see war movies. You see the John Wick stuff. You see a lot of firearms usage. And there are some exceptions, but the great majority of that is grossly unrealistic. But you have a lot of people who have no experience or very little experience with firearms watching that kind of stuff, and they start thinking it's real. And the worst of all of these are your modern first-person shooter video games. The designers of these games often put a lot of effort into making them as realistic as a video game can be. And we now have a couple of generations of people who have very little to no experience with real firearms, but they think they have it all figured out based on playing a video game. And I've actually had a disturbingly high number of people contact me and telling me that my gun's defective or that I'm doing it wrong, because they really think that having never touched a real firearm, but playing a video game version of it, gives them more knowledge than I have from being in the field with a real firearm. And that is something that's going to cause people to do things that are dangerous, and it's going to get somebody hurt, and it's something that as a firearms owner, you need to know that video games aren't real. And you've got to be aware that there are people who don't understand that. Okay, let's go to point 8. Now, before we get to point 8, you might wonder why with every point on this top 10 list I'm changing locations. I'm standing over there and then I'm sitting here. The reason for that is so that when you decide you don't need to listen to this segment in its entirety, it'll make it easier for you to fast forward to the next segment. Okay, point 8 is sources do not always agree with each other. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about differences of opinion, where I might tell you that for concealed carry, 40 Smith & Wesson is better than 9x19, and the next person might tell you that 9x19 is better than 40 Smith & Wesson. Those are differences of opinion. I mean sources that are claiming to give you the facts. Facts like the first president of the United States was George Washington, the capital of Montana is Helena. Now, we would hope that no source gets things like that wrong. But when you're dealing with firearms and many other things, sources don't always agree. For example, when I tried to look up online when 9x19 was introduced, I saw sources that claimed it was 1909, 1907, 1905, a couple that claimed it was 1901. Sources don't always agree, and I see the same thing when I'm trying to figure out in what year was .38 Super Auto introduced. You'll see different things. Now, it might seem kind of trivial to argue over the importance of, was .30-30 introduced in 1896 or was it 1895? Many people would say it doesn't really matter. But there's a lot of other stuff where, depending on what you're talking about, it might matter a great deal. And you have to understand that when you're doing research in terms of firearms, sources don't always agree. You have to look at multiple sources, and even when you do, you still might not have the facts exactly right. Now, about the best illustration of this that I can think is, if you want to see sources disagreeing, do a Google search of your own name. I've seen things that claim that I'm married to people that I've never met, things that claim that I am currently married to someone whom I divorced 30 years ago, claim that I live in cities where I've never lived, claim that I live in a city where, no, I don't live there, I lived there 30 years ago, things like that. There was an article about me online just recently, like in the last couple of weeks, that had a title that was something about things you don't know about Paul Harrell. Okay, and I read it, and well, there was some things on there I didn't know, talking about something that happened to me in 2007. No, it was 2006, and even what they reported wasn't really accurate. This article also claimed that I had been in the Navy. No, I wasn't, and many other things. Sources do not always agree with each other. Okay, let's go to point 9. Point 9 has two very important disclaimers. One, I'm going to be brief. We will discuss this in much greater depth in the long version. And two, there are some exceptions to point 9. So please don't give me any feedback. Oh yeah, Paul, well what about? There are some exceptions. Okay, point 9 is this. Gun laws don't make sense. Now, when I say exceptions, many municipalities will have ordinances prohibiting the discharge of firearms within the city limits, and they'll have exceptions like for established indoor ranges and things like that. Okay, prohibiting the discharge of a firearm within the city limits, unless it's some kind of emergency or some exception like that, I've got to say that's going to be most of the time probably a pretty good idea. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, gun laws are nonsensical. And if you fail to understand that, it can lead to some real frustration. And I've had some frustrating conversations with a couple of people. A really good example is, I knew somebody who saw the Taurus judge, and he thought that what would be a better idea would be to have a revolver like that, maybe with only a 4-shot cylinder, that was 20 gauge, not 410. And I told him, yeah, that sounds cool, but you couldn't do that. That would be illegal. What for? Because here in the United States, there's exceptions for old stuff that's grandfathered in, but you can't manufacture or import sporting arms in calibers larger than 50. Well, what about your .72 caliber rifle? That's muzzle loading. It's exempt from that, even though the gun is new. It's still muzzle loading. What about your 12 gauge shotgun? 12 gauge is .72 caliber. That's bigger than 50. That's a shotgun. That's exempt from that. Well, the Taurus Judge is a shotgun. No, it's not. It's a handgun. It's a revolver. It's caliber .45 Colt. It has a rifled barrel. It's a .45 revolver that just happens to be able to chamber 410 bore shot shells. Then what if we made my 20 gauge revolver with a rifled barrel? Then it'd be a sporting arm in caliber larger than 50, because 20 gauge is 62 caliber. Well, then we could give it a smoothbore. Then it'd be a shotgun with a barrel that's too short. Well, that's stupid! My point exactly. Gun laws are very often contradictory, and they just don't make sense. Let me show you another example. Here's my A1 platform. Now, this is a composite rifle, not made of composite, in the sense that it's made from different parts at different times. The lower receiver is a Bushmaster, but the pistol grip, the stock, the upper receiver, the handguards, are genuine Colt M16 A1. Now, it's got an AR-15 bolt, and of course there's no full auto sear in the lower receiver, so it's perfectly legal. Okay, but if the upper receiver is a genuine Colt M16 A1, it should have a bayonet lug, and this one doesn't. Why? Because in the disassembly, reassembly process of this, it was during that Bill Crime gun ban when you couldn't have such things, and so to be compliant with the law, the previous owner thought it'd be a good idea to remove that. Okay, probably was. But no bayonet lug? So what you're telling me is I can take this semi-auto rifle, put in a 30-shot magazine, and that's okay, but don't put a knife on it, then you might hurt somebody. Gun laws, for the most part, just don't make sense. They are often sponsored by and passed by politicians that are grossly ignorant, like that California legislator, you can look him up, who was talking about the 30 magazine clip. Very often they are passed by politicians who want to pass what we call soundbite legislation. They pass things like that so Bill Clinton can say that he helped keep guns out of the hands of our children. And sadly, very often gun laws are passed by dishonest people. They'll talk about reducing crime and keeping children safe. No, for them it's about just making firearms completely illegal except for the wealthy elite. And so anything they can pass that will make it just a little more expensive for you or make it just a little more difficult for you to exercise your constitutional rights will allow them to eventually erode those rights completely so no one can have firearms except the wealthy elite. And they lie and say it's about keeping children safe. No, it's just about prohibiting firearms. The bottom line here is gun laws, for the great most part, don't make sense. And if you understand that, it will save you a lot of frustration. Point 10 requires a little bit of demonstration. This is my Remington Model 11 shotgun. It's an auto-loading 12 gauge with a 2 3/4 inch chamber. And we've got a few soda jugs set up. Now that made pretty short work of those soda jugs. But what's my point? Let's discuss that. So what was the point of that demonstration? Let me see if I can explain it. This is my Remington Model 11 12 gauge shotgun. This gun, I don't mean this model, I mean this individual gun has been in my family for decades and I've been using it on a regular basis since before I was old enough to drive. It's 12 gauge, 2 3/4 inch chamber, auto loading with a capacity of 4+1. I have used it to shoot game birds like ducks, grouse, quail, to shoot animals like jackrabbits. I've killed a couple of deer with it. And it has always worked very reliably, very accurately, very effectively for me. Now, if I were to go today to a well-stocked, modern gun store, and I were to look at 12 gauge auto-loading shotguns with tube magazines, I would probably find that most of them would have a greater magazine capacity. Most of them would be shorter than this, and they would almost certainly all be lighter than this. And are those advantages? Yes, they are. However, when hunting game birds, I'm relegated to 2+1 anyway. When hunting animals like rabbits or deer, I've found that 5 has always been plenty. And if we were talking about a home defense type gun, with the information I've been able to find, in talking about legitimate citizen-involved self-defense shootings, where it's a home defense situation and the home resident or homeowner is armed with a shotgun, I can't find any documented case where anyone ever needed more than 5 rounds. So a greater magazine capacity would not be a bad thing, but most of the time that's going to be superfluous. And so this gun works pretty well. And it brings me to the point, which is point 10. Old does not mean obsolete. Part of the American mentality that we so often have, even though here in the United States we love antiques, we have this mentality that unless something is brand new, it just doesn't work. And so a lot of people will see me using this gun and think, well, will that really work? Yes, it will work very effectively. And part of this mentality is also fostered by marketing in various industries like the automotive industry or the firearms industry, because the gun store doesn't make any money off me continuing to use the same shotgun for 40 plus years. They make money off selling me a new one, so they try to convince me that old means obsolete. And no, old does not mean obsolete. Now there's a second half to this. Old does not mean obsolete, and obsolete does not mean ineffective. Now this is a Marlin Model 30AS, lever action rifle caliber 30-30. Very similar to the 336. Now, this, not necessarily this particular one, but this one and a couple of others virtually identical to it, I've used in deer hunting and various other applications many times. And I've found that for me, in the environment in which I hunt deer, it worked just fine. But when we're talking about lever action rifles, there are a lot of people who will tell you that bolt action is better than lever action. Bolt action is inherently more accurate than lever action. Bolt action rifles are easier to put a scope on than lever action rifles. And most bolt action rifles have an internal box magazine, as where most lever actions will have a tube magazine, meaning that the bolt action rifle can allow you to use a wider variety of projectile types. And all of those things are, to some degree, maybe a little bit more or less true. At least they're arguable. So does that make this rifle obsolete? Many people will say yes. And the 30-30 cartridge. Sources don't always agree with each other, but according to the sources I've seen, 30-30 was introduced in 1896. And it was the first smokeless powder cartridge. Prior to that, there'd been black powder cartridges where you could get new ammo that was available loaded with smokeless powder, loaded to the same chamber pressures as the black powder had been. But the 30-30, originally called the 30 Winchester centerfire, was the first cartridge designed as a smokeless powder cartridge, and it was touted as, at that time, the latest, greatest, and long-range, accurate, powerful rifle. And it would do all those things needed, like home defense and shooting game that was about the size of deer. Okay. But it wasn't very long after that before the 30-40 was introduced, which is significantly more powerful. And then, according to the sources I've seen, you have cartridges like 303 British and 7.62x54R, which originally had been black powder cartridges. Now you got the smokeless powder version of that, which in this case was significantly more powerful. Then you got the 30-03, which is superseded by the 30-06, and so it's not very many years after the introduction of the 30-30 before you've got a lot of stuff out there that's significantly more powerful. And then as the decades go by, you get 300 Savage and 308 Winchester. And so you have all these 30 caliber cartridges, or at least pretty close to 30 caliber, which are significantly more powerful. So the 30-30 at one time having been the long range, high velocity cartridge is now the short range, low velocity version of all of these. And there's people who would argue that it is obsolete. Well, let's just, for the sake of argument, say they're correct and it's obsolete. All of these newer cartridges are more powerful. They are longer range. But we get this mentality that because this is obsolete, that somehow it won't do its intended task anymore, which is, for the most part, shoot deer at reasonable ranges. As I'm sitting here right now today, deer hunting season in this area is going to start in about 10 days. This morning, just before I got to our range here, I saw a nice forked horn buck. He crossed the road in front of me, and he would have been a really easy shot to make with this 30-30. In doing the 12 gauge demonstration a few minutes ago, I had to wait for some deer to move so I could shoot there. because there was a couple of deer bedded down just laying there looking at me about 100 meters into the impact area. Would have been very easy shot for this 30-30. So the idea that it's obsolete, okay, but the idea that that means that it can't do its intended task, no, not at all. I've shot several deer very successfully with the 30-30. And there's a lot of people that have this mentality that because it's obsolete, that it won't work anymore. And I've told you all these stories before about the guy who thought that 60 yards was too far to shoot a 30-30, and the guy who was hunting deer with a 30-30 saw one at 70 yards away, so he figured he needed to elevate and shoot a foot over the deer's back. Okay, and then you got to add some because you want to hit the deer in the center of the chest. You thought a 30-30 was going to drop that much at 70 yards? A 30 carbine wouldn't drop that much. A 30 super carry wouldn't drop that much. But you have this mentality that just because it's obsolete, that it's ineffective. And I see this a lot when talking about doing black powder hunting, and I'll explain to somebody that I'm going to go hunting with my muzzle loading rifle. What? And you know, like Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, the Alamo, you know, powder patch ball. And I've actually had, while explaining that, people say, would that really kill a deer? Yes, yes it will. But you have this mentality that because that firearm really is obsolete, that somehow it won't do the task it was intended to do. And so point 10 is you got to get that out of your mind, and you have to be aware that old does not mean obsolete, and obsolete does not mean ineffective. And there's my top 10. Now, are there other things that might be useful to know? Things like 12 gauge and 16 gauge are not interchangeable. Other things that might be interesting to know, like 7.62 by 51 and 7.62 by 51R, are not even close to the same thing. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there like that. But these are the top 10 things that, in my opinion, you really need to know to be a firearms owner. Now, if you have a top 10 list that's different than mine, I'd love to hear about it. Please post it in the comments. And thanks for watching.